the AI trap, a prediction concerning the future of humanity. This presentation will demonstrate how radical feminism, population replacement, and AI infrastructure are engineering the replacement of human beings. When the point is reached where women lose the inherent and divine quality that differentiates them from men, humanity as we know it will come to an end. In the early parts of the 20th century, the Great War brought women out of the home and into the factories in order to build the munitions and other technology required to wage the First World War. This practice inevitably produced the types of conditions required to industrialize humanity. Initially marked as a temporary frontline service, this socio-economic revolution fueled the transition to industrialization. We fast forward to today in 2026, the digital age shifts workers yet again. This transition requires heavy physical infrastructure, the same way that the Industrial Revolution did. However, this time around, female workers will be deployed en masse to the front lines of construction. If getting women out of the home and into the munitions plants is how the world became industrialized, then getting women out of the office and into the front lines of construction is how the world becomes digitalized. But how do the ruling elite get women out of the office and into the construction sites to build the digital grid? To answer this question, let's examine the situation from the perspective of one of the longest running social conditioning campaigns that humanity has ever seen. I am, of course, talking about radical feminism, aka the gender equality movement. Rising to prominence in 1970, radical feminism calls for the reordering of society in which male supremacy, patriarchy, is eliminated. This radical reordering applies to social, political, and economic contexts in which men, patriarchy, currently dominate and oppress women. Radical feminism paved the way for more modern figures to lean heavily into the women's liberation and girl power movements, an ideology that today we refer to as gender equality. Unbeknownst to most, however, is that the radical doctrine underpinning some of these more modern themes, whilst on the surface appear fun and rebellious, originally stem from a place of deeply seated cynicism and resentment. A type of resentment that, when fully fledged, calls the virtue and intentions of a seemingly humble social movement directly into question. So, in a fundamental sense, radical feminism draws heavily on the communist ideologies of Marx and Engels. It advocates for the outsourcing of pregnancy to technology, cyberfeminism. It calls for the abolition of patriarchal systems to be replaced by gender egalitarianism. It looks to collapse the sex distinction. So according to radical feminism, there is no difference between men and women. Radical feminism pits women against men and identifies the agents of their oppression as men. And it asserts that a woman's true calling is found by providing for herself through her work. Here we have a bar graph illustrating the impact of the radical feminist gender equality movement on birth rates. This data is drawn from the Australian population and was collected from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So if we observe the graph here on our left, what we discover is the birth rates, that is here, for women between the ages of 20 to 24 in 1955 were in this vicinity here. So in 1950 to 1970, before radical feminism, births were 183 per 1,000 women between the ages of 20 to 24. In the gender equality era, that is 2003 to 2023, births were all the way down here. So 43 births per 1,000 women. That is a decline of 76.5%. If we examine the next graph over, we discover that births have decreased 54.4% for women aged between 25 to 29, And if we average it out for women in their 20s, we discover overall a 65.5% decrease for women aged 20 to 29. These next two charts illustrate the cost of owning a home in 1955 compared to home ownership in 2025. It's contrasted with annual wage increases highlighted in grey. As you can see in the figure on the left, if you kind of squint, we have 1955 housing versus wages. This tiny little column here. So in 1955, the average home was $7,350 and the average wage was $3,300. If we then compare that to today, this monolithic column here, we can see that in 2025, the average wage is $80,000 for a single person, and the average house price is $1.2 million, a rather significant increase. We have the next chart over demonstrates a similar sort of thing, just in a different style. So what we can observe here is house prices skyrocketing. It's almost going straight up. But when we compare it to earnings, it's remaining, by comparison, relatively flat. The dual income trap, housing costs, and peak fertility. In 1950s, the average home cost 2.3 times the single yearly average income. In 2026, the average home costs 14 times the single average yearly income. We also observe a 76.5% decrease in the fertility rate of women aged 20 to 24. So what does it mean? Well, it means the erosion of a single income household. So even if you did want to operate on more traditional, conventional lines, the likelihood of your ability to do so is pretty much zero. We see 75% of households now dependent on dual incomes. This ultimately leads to decreases in familial harmony and overall life satisfaction. We also see peak biological reproductive years in women hit hardest. So we all observe the dual income paradigm, and most of us, we live it and we experience it, but who actually benefits from the dual income trap? Well, it's not the family, as the family experiences decreased life satisfaction and time poverty. They also somehow counterintuitively experience an incomprehensible rise in associated living costs. It's not the individual. The individual faces reliance on institutional systems. They're also too busy to notice nefarious government schemes like population replacement, for example. It's not the women who benefit. It's not the children either, because they're not actually being born. The women are now being forced to exist in the industrial world where they have to compete for jobs and resources. What we find is it is the state that benefits. As the state doubles the active income tax base, they get to increase their bureaucracy and, by extension, wasteful government spending. It's also the market that benefits, as they get to suppress base wages by doubling the labour supply. This ultimately gives life to the wage slave. Detachment theory, Australia's population replacement. So the idea here is that the gender equality movement, radical feminism, actively encourages women in their 20s to detach from their biological urges and maternal instincts in order to pursue a career. Coinciding with its inception, births have remained below the replacement rate for 50 consecutive years. As a result of declining births, immigration now accounts for 79% of current total population growth. Overseas-born group outpaces Australian-born group by 200,000 individuals annually. Mathematical projection places established population in the minority by 2076. The Great Replacement. The Great Replacement theory centers around an idea that global elites are carrying out a plan to methodically and systematically replace white Western populations with non-white immigrant populations. The theory receives a great deal of criticism and is largely dismissed by most scholars. A quick search online will render a disclaimer condemning the theory as a false and dangerous conspiracy that stokes racial fears. When we simply just look at the figures, however, so taking all of the emotion out of it, what we find is that here in this country, with 32% of its inhabitants born overseas, up from 20% in 1980, what we discover is that the population replacement model appears to be increasingly justified and can be explained via a simple mathematical equation. So the total population is 27.6 million. Born in Australia, 18.8 million, 68%. Born overseas, 8.8 million, 32%. 18.8 million Australian born minus the 8.8 million overseas born leaves us with a gap of 10 million. 10 million divided by the net annual gain through immigration, that is 200,000 people per year, leaves us with a sum of 50. So that is 10 million divided by 200,000 leaves us with 50. We then take the 50 and add it to the current year, which is 2026. So 2026 plus 50 equals 2076. So according to this mathematical calculation, what we can deduce is that Australia's population will be replaced by the year 2076. The real reason for excessive immigration. We have to ask ourselves, why would the government want a foreign, detached voting public as opposed to a homegrown, nationalistic one? Well, typically, white Western populations believe in individualism, freedom, liberty, and the right to self-determination. These ideals, however, are counterproductive to the current globalist agenda. Imported populations, on the other hand, tend to hold collectivist ideals, are less skeptical of governments, and are more likely to conform to tyrannical regimes. A detached society has no skin in the game, divided by arbitrary political lines, misled by state-run propaganda, and distracted by materialism and social media. A detached society is unlikely to notice social engineering and less likely to care about long-term consequences. The great replacement ultimately gives way to the great displacement. Artificial intelligence to replace repetitive data-driven jobs. 88% of Australian corporations are willing to implement automation immediately if they have the time, capacity, and support to do so. According to Victoria University, jobs that rely heavily on routine, predictable tasks such as data entry, bookkeeping, call center roles, and admin functions will likely be replaced by AI. Leading AI developers claim that only two types of people will succeed in the AI era: trade workers and the neurodivergent. The Australian government says that adaptability will be crucial for Australia to realise the potential benefits from AI, which will see new jobs emerge and existing jobs change. While society is distracted, divided, and actively being replaced, AI will effortlessly make redundant, repetitive, data-heavy roles typically performed by women. As illustrated in the current table, jobs that seem certain to be replaced by AI also happen to be jobs held historically by women. The digital revolution is poised to displace almost the entirety of the female workforce. But is anybody talking about this? Is anybody screaming from the hills about the effects this is going to have on women and their ability to participate in the workforce? Is anyone advocating for the just and fair treatment of women and for the protection of their working rights? Are the radical feminists out here saying, hey, artificial intelligence, hands off our jobs? No, not in the least. We do, however, observe the government and the media advocating for an increase in female participation within the building and construction industry. Well, why would that be, I wonder? It's almost like they are preparing the women of this country for something new. A digital revolution, perhaps, where a woman's only value and sole purpose is to build the data centers and assemble the equipment required to bring forth the digital age. So as we mentioned, generative AI disproportionately automates clerical, administrative, and data-heavy roles. As we've discussed, these sectors possess historically high female participation rates. We're observing government-funded initiatives designed to pipeline displaced office labour into the physical trades, where it's been mentioned that jobs requiring manual labour remain highly insulated from automation. So the future of female employment looks a little bit something like this and is being supported by, as I mentioned, 12 state-run government initiatives, the likes of which include Allyship in Action, transforming culture to attract and retain women in construction, building futures, breaking the barriers for women in the plumbing industry, level the site, women in construction, empower her pathways, see what you can be. So here we have some more propaganda designed to support women in their transition into the construction industry. This first one here comes to us from the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations. Women in construction and infrastructure participation targets. It appears as though the federal government has targets now for getting women into construction. The next one down is from RMIT University. This is addressing gender equality on the construction site. And perhaps the most telling or unnerving initiative comes to us from the Building Women's Careers, where it's stated here, transform your future, explore the industries of tomorrow, and unlock your potential. I mean, this last initiative right here has to be the most compelling piece of evidence relating to the transition of women into construction. I mean, we just have to listen to what is being laid out in front of us by state and corporate Australia. And when we do, I'm not sure how we can arrive at any other conclusion. Corporate Australia is telling us that they are ready and willing to automate. The AI founders, i.e. the Peter Thiels, the Mark Zuckerbergs, and the Sam Altmans of the world, the AI CEOs, are telling us that unless we possess some sort of unique neurodivergence, we need to start preparing for a life in construction. The universities are producing research indicating that jobs that rely heavily on repetitive data-driven tasks will be replaced by AI. And the government is basically saying that our ability to adapt, or our adaptability to the new world, will be critical to our survival. If we want to understand where a country is heading and where its interests lie, all we need to do is look at how that country is spending its money. Given that Australia is currently experiencing a housing unaffordability crisis, the likes of which have never before been seen, we might expect a big allocation of funds aimed at alleviating housing shortages. But when we contrast this allocation with the amount of money that is set to be poured into the AI sector, it becomes clear that the Australian government cares a lot more about AI infrastructure than it does about providing affordable housing for its citizens. If we take this graph here on the left, we have the budget for housing versus the budget for AI. In the grey, we can see that there is an allocation of funds for housing. However, if we observe the column to the right, we can see that it is dwarfed by the $73.3 billion that the federal government has pledged towards a deal between OpenAI and NextDC, which is a scaled data grid agreement. This agreement focuses its resources away from human augmented software, whereby the capital is concentrated towards building a self-sustaining sovereign digital infrastructure. To reiterate, the AI revolution will take place in the following way. Women will be forcibly encouraged to become men through the gender equality movement. We observe this happening today. Established population unable to meet fertility targets. Population is replaced through immigration. We also observe this occurring presently. Governments and AI sector preparing women for their new roles in construction. The gender equality movement will convince women to embrace these roles through propaganda. Current population unlikely to notice or care due to socially engineered detachment. Imported populations will conform with the agenda as they possess collectivist attitudes and are less likely to speak up against nefarious government plots. AI ushers in an era of techno-feudalism where human beings serve their digital masters until they can be replaced by machines. Perhaps the most telling piece of evidence that these events are likely to transpire comes to us in the form of a massive bet that Silicon Valley placed against humanity. So in the early days, artificial intelligence was sold as a way to augment human interaction and enhance our everyday lives. The metaverse, we can cast our minds back to the metaverse, was tipped to become the next step in achieving a world where humanity becomes enriched by technology. After losses exceeding $70 billion, however, the Mark Zuckerberg-owned company Meta shuts down the augmented reality sim. The post-metaverse business model, now based on humans serving technology, as opposed to the other way around, which would be technology serving humans. So just how is it that humanity is going to be serving technology? Well, let me introduce you to Project Stargate, a new form of life on Earth. The Trump administration pledges $500 billion to fund companies like OpenAI, SoftBank, and Oracle. The intention is to build 5 new major AI data center campuses across America. The aim is to provide massive amounts of computational power required to train and run the next generation of artificial intelligence models. This will transition current AI infrastructure from traditional data collection and storage systems towards the next generation of artificial intelligence. Project Stargate, if successful, will teach AI to compute, or in other words, learn. Project Stargate will be responsible for creating the world's first self-sustaining digital consciousness. In essence, a new form of life on Earth. The final stage of humanity, the age of digitalization. Artificial intelligence is not here to enhance or improve human life. It is here to replace it. The newly created digital consciousness will give self-sustaining autonomous life to machines and robots. When the digital hubs are operational, the men and women who built them will be discarded. When the robots learn that human beings are, by way of their nature, inefficient, corrupt, and outdated, they will delete us, the same way that current day tech updates or supersedes outdated computer programs. If Project Stargate is successful in its objectives, humanity as we know it will cease to exist. In conclusion, digitalization requires massive amounts of human life force and physical labor to construct the digital grids. Once the automated network is fully operational, human capital becomes structurally obsolete. The statistics that we've provided have traced the path from labor re-engineering to demographic replacement, culminating in a post-human society.